Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by 417 Helmets. It's collectible helmets and more. Mini football helmets from just about every dead and forgotten football league you've ever heard of. Also, mini baseball helmets from the Negro Leagues, as well as custom helmets. You want your business or your organization represented in a cool mini helmet format? Hey, check them out. 417helmets.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
All right, we're going to switch up gears here and take you back to Truist Park and talk about one of my favorite things, the food. The new baseball season brings new food items to the Truist Park menu, so you want to bring your appetite and an open mind. And Jerry Carnes got one of the coolest assignments today. He's introducing us to the new flavors of the ballpark.
Move over, Peanuts and Cracker Jacks. It's time for some ballpark food that's the taste of the town.
The inspiration is really Braves country, right? First, I want to take Braves country. Once I understand what those elements were with Braves country, then put them into some dishes.
How do you get more Braves country than a BLT that uses bologna as the B? Fried bologna, that is.
I can see the pimento cheese.
That's right. This BLT also has a P. Pimento cheese.
3 thumbs up.
This season at Truist Park, you can munch on a cleanup burger, 4 hamburger patties with waffles for a bun.
Fried egg on there, it's home fried potatoes on there, a little maple syrup, spicy maple syrup. That was probably the one that we don't want you to count calories, right? So when you come to the stadium, there's no counting calories, right? You want to be able to have some fun.
Don't bring your calorie counter to the ballpark if you plan to dive into this 3-foot-long sub sandwich designed for 8 people, but if you want to spend $80, you can have it all to yourself. There's the Dewey Dog, and Dewey sausage topped with chili and fried onions. There are dishes with a Caribbean flair. Chef Louis Matarano wants to make sure his dishes cover every corner of Braves country.
The cultures of Georgia are huge. We have such a great big melting pot here, and I want to bring more of that in.
Where have you been all my life?
He had me at fried bologna and pimento cheese.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Man, I'm hungry. I don't know about you. I'll start taking your orders in just a few minutes. But hi there. My name is Tim Hanlon, and it is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us. Beyond whetting your appetite, we are going to get into a heady topic this week as something that we've kind of nibbled around on a lot of different occasions when we talk about various stadiums of the past and, frankly, our little jaded view on perhaps where pro sports is going now in the big era of private equity and all these outrageous valuations and expectations of such. And the topic this week and the title this week is Mallparks. This is the book that's written by our guest this week, Michael Friedman. He a professor at the University of Maryland, and his new book, courtesy of the Cornell University Press, is called Mallparks, Baseball Stadiums and the Culture of Consumption. And as you can get the drift pretty quickly by all those food offerings at this year's Atlanta Braves games and the title of this book, we're going to be sort of talking about this sort of this collision, I guess, between functional stadium and ballpark and that of the creature comforts and the expectations of fans and their owners of creating experiences, food being prime among them, but also just, it's not about going to the game anymore and watching 9 players on a team playing each other in a battle of skill and wits and strategy. Aided by now a pitch clock and some other sort of innovations. But it's also about what kind of food am I going to have and how comfortable are the seats and where am I sitting relative to my other friends or the hoi polloi, shall we say? Or, how can we make the environment more exciting? Are there any other attractions in the stadium, around the stadium, in the general vicinity? And that's kind of the topic at hand this week as we talk about sort of this collision between sport and commerce. This is a fascinating topic, and I think all of you will enjoy it. And it's also not new. We'll hear in our conversation coming up with Michael in a few minutes, the idea of baseball being a big business is not new. It goes back, frankly, to the earliest days of when professionalism started to creep into the game. And obviously, baseball is the longest standing in American sports professionalism for sure, and that's hence the sort of a focus on baseball specific. But it's not unique just to baseball, right? Anytime we see cities being shaken down for new billion-dollar stadiums here and construction projects there, and whether Las Vegas and the A's or the Buffalo Bills new stadium or the shakedown that went on in Nashville to get the Titans new, on and on and on. And that clip that you heard at the beginning, it really, I think, is probably the most, I would call it most extreme version. It's Jerry Carnes from WXIA TV channel 11 Alive in Atlanta. That was a piece that he did about 2 months ago, which is now becoming pretty common for just about every ballpark now. The PR starts in earnest as the season sort of gets going. What's the new food lineup going to be this season? And that's, of course, just one piece of it. But Atlanta's stadium is frankly, I think, the template for where most of this is going in stadium land these days, and that is. It's real estate. It's a real estate play. Truist Park sits in a brand new development. It was opened in 2017. It's about 10 miles northwest of downtown Atlanta in Cobb County. And it is a stadium that sits literally within the midst of there's no better word for it, complex, a business complex of office buildings. There's a hotel in there. There's some other sort of attractions. It is called the Battery Atlanta. It is literally a destination and even work-oriented real estate development in which a baseball park has been sort of centered in the midst of. And if you want to be cynical about professional sports, look no further than this development. Maybe even the Chicago Cubs building around Wrigley Field. You look at what the Chicago Bears are supposedly trying to do in suburban Arlington Heights here in northern Illinois. It's all about what's around and within the stadium environment. Beyond just the game, it's about all the various attractions and things that can keep people occupied and entertained, and perhaps even distracted if they're not doing very well on the field. And we see it over and over and over again. We see it with the A's going to, we think, Las Vegas. We see it in the developments around the Phoenix Coyotes NHL thing going on there, if they still stay there. And it's almost now part and parcel of the expectation now of fans and teams, frankly, to generate new revenue streams and all of that kind of stuff. But we're going to sort of dial all that back and sort of see how we kind of got here. Is it a good thing? Is it potentially artificially inflating the franchise values of these teams? And where does it go from here? How can it get much more than this at this point? I mean, do we need cars picking you up and privately driving you to the stadium, or maybe not even going to the games anymore at that, maybe with virtual reality? I don't know where it all leads, but it ain't your dad's ballpark experience and getting a hot dog and getting mustard all over yourself and maybe a Coke or a Pepsi on top of it. It's so much more than that. And we're going to get into that, what I think is a fascinating conversation and discussion around Mallparks and how we sort of got to this point with our guest this week, Professor Michael Friedman, he the author of said book. And it's a very interesting conversation. You could maybe even call it perhaps a companion to our episode number 123 from back in July of 2019 with our friend Paul Goldberger when we're talking about various ballparks and from an architectural perspective and where they sit sort of in urban design and the American city and that kind of stuff. I think this is a very good tentpole or parallel to that conversation. So give that a listen as well. But stay tuned for this one. I think you'll enjoy it very much. And I think the most appropriate sponsor we can offer up for you this week is our friends at oldschoolshirts.com. And if you haven't partaken of the various wares offered to you by oldschoolshirts.com, well, please stop what you're doing, stop this podcast, and go toot sweet to oldschoolshirts.com and search up just about any team or league in the past, but also I think uniquely and curiously for this episode, two interesting zones on the website that you can understand as sort of being foundational to this conversation. One is a section called Dead Malls. So if you remember various malls from growing up in places like, in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, like Randall Park in North Randall, Ohio, or the Northland Mall, the Six Flags Mall. Perhaps you remember the Northwest Mall in Houston, Texas, or the Uptown Square Mall in New Orleans. Those East Town Mall for you, our friends in Knoxville. These are amazing places that we spent a lot of our youth in, sort of just killing time and maybe even making some purchases and stuff. These are all lovingly remembered and created for you and awaiting you at oldschoolshirts.com for purchase. If there's a mall that you remember fondly by hanging out in those hallowed halls, well, here's your place to go at oldschoolshirts.com. Now, then you can go over to the stadiums section. So if you remember the Summit in Houston, or perhaps Aloha Stadium, which is sort of being reinvented or rethought in Honolulu, Metropolitan Stadium in Minnesota, which, as you probably know now, is where the Mall of America now sits, etc. You can go to that section at oldschoolshirts.com and blend the two. So take one or two from the Dead Mall section and then buy a shirt or two from the stadium section, and you'll be fully prepared to enjoy the background and the fulfillment of this episode as we devote our conversation to Mallparks. But check them out, and it's not just that, but all kinds of teams and leagues and cities and various collections, all there for you at oldschoolshirts.com. The quality is excellent. You can choose different sizes and shapes and forms, and of course, we have a promo code for you there too. It's Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. Oldschoolshirts.com, promo code Good Seats for 10% off. Thank you to oldschoolshirts.com for your continued patronage and support of this show. And of course, we thank you, kind listener, for listening on to what I think is a fascinating discussion about Mallparks. Let's talk about how we got here from the humble old days of little fields and ballparks that just, were there to design for you just to sit and enjoy a baseball game or two. Now it's so much more. Here's our conversation that we had with Michael Friedman just a couple of days back. So please, as always, enjoy. I was fascinated when this book sort of crossed my my radar because it is absolutely, I guess, a lament of ours and I guess a source of intrigue as I guess you could say baseball has become more corporate, although it's maybe not necessarily a new thing if you look back in history. But before we sort of jump right into that, I would love you to kind of set up for our audience who you are, your background, and your entree into this tome, because you do set it out in the beginning of this book, actually quite personally, from a bunch of different angles that seem to intersect.
Yes. I am a lecturer at the University of Maryland. Got my PhD there in 2008. And I've been studying stadiums, from an academic perspective, probably going back almost 25 years. I did my master's thesis on the football stadium in Nashville, the politics that surrounded that, and then a couple of projects while I was working on my PhD. Looked at Camden Yards, looked at Fenway Park, even spent some time looking at Tiger Stadium and in its final days, and I wrote my dissertation on Nationals Park here in Washington, D.C. So academically, I've been really just focused on this subject for a number of years. Now, personally, in the summer of 1984, I was 13 years old, and my father picked me up for my brother's graduation, high school graduation in Nashville, Tennessee. And for the next 6 weeks, he drove me around the country. The two of us were together. We were going from city to city, stadium to stadium. Over those 6 weeks, we were able to see 21 of the 26 ballparks that were in operation then. Two I had seen previously. So on that trip, I could say by the end of the summer of 1984, I had seen games at 23 of 26 major league ballparks. Continued to go to a few. Now, there was a period for about 3 months at the end of 2019 when I could say that I've been to every major league stadium that is in current use. However, I haven't made it down to the new one in Texas yet. So right now I'm stuck at 49 stadiums, major league stadiums, where I've seen baseball games.
Seems to be a moving target, right? I mean, as we record this, right, we're talking about Oakland presumably going to Las Vegas, and Nashville, your home environs, circling more with intensity, I think, around either getting an expansion or a relocated franchise, and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's I hate to say they make more, but I mean, and also not to sort of delve into sort of the field of schemes. Sorry, a very excellent blog, which I'm sure you follow, right?
Yes.
The intensity around how not only ballparks but stadiums generally and arenas. You don't come at this from an economic perspective or a political perspective per se, though, right?
No, I don't. I mean, the economics of stadiums not only are pretty clear. I mean, they're terrible deals, but every economist who has ever looked at this from a neutral perspective, i.e., somebody not being paid by the teams or the cities to produce a study that justifies the level of public expenditure. Every economist who have looked at this neutrally have said there's no positive benefit. Certainly not a benefit that justifies the level of spending. A few people have found some positive effects, but very small, very minor. The politics of this, again, there's a lot of converging opinion on why these stadiums get built, because they're asking the public for a lot of money, but at a subsidy of $50 or $100 per year per person, that's not exactly going to be causing massive resistance, because government spends a lot of money on things that people don't like, but people don't fight either. And of course, on the other end of the equation, you have billionaire team owners getting these massive subsidies. You have players getting lots of money. You have construction interests, big business. Everybody's doing really well with these stadiums. So and of course the media as well. So there tends to be kind of the old saw concentrated benefits and diffused costs. Where I'm looking at this is pretty much saying almost those two are given. So let's take a look at how stadiums really fit into our communities. How can we understand a stadium from the way it sits in a city and impacts the surrounding area? How can we understand how a baseball stadium sits in people's memories, and the ways that those memories are recycled in the stadium itself, in its design, in the ways that the stadium is decorated. And then also keeping in mind that ever since 1862, when Bill Kammeyer built the Union Grounds in Brooklyn, every one of these stadiums, ballparks, super stadiums, baseball grounds, however you want to describe them, going back to day one, it's about making making a dollar. It's about charging people good money to see high quality baseball and figuring out how to really maximize the dollars people are going to spend watching baseball.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up Kallmeyer, which is mentioned in your book as a sort of foundational component to this, kind of showing that, which is sort of I guess my next sort of question is that none of this is new. It's probably just grander and deeper and more robust and perhaps maybe more fraught with economic perils should things go awry. But your citation of Kallmeyer at the Union Grounds in Brooklyn in 1862, in essence, it's also a little bit of the economics, I guess, of a captive audience, right? Because that was, as you described, the first baseball facility, essentially a field to enclose itself, right? Or to be enclosed, which in essence meant or hinted at the eventuality of paying for the privilege of such, right? This is not an open field kind of come one, come all kind of thing. And there the economics, I guess, sort of become rooted and perhaps unwittingly what we have morphed into today.
Well, I mean, baseball has been a business really ever since the late 1850s. And the people who are operating it have just gotten more sophisticated, and the dollars involved have just increased over time. And it's no surprise that we've gotten to where we've gotten today, because team owners are just looking at it and saying, okay, how can we get every nickel of spending that we can achieve?
All right, so I want to kind of get to the sort of the groundings of this, because this is a very rich book, obviously very sort of an academic bent to it, but there's plenty of accessibility, I guess, to the, I wouldn't call it average fan, but the shall we say the sophisticated fan. I consider myself as one on an occasion, but it's sort of a thinking man's kind of approach to this kind of stuff, because we've tackled this a little bit from an architectural perspective with our pal Paul Goldberger a couple of years back. But this is sort of a broader, I think, sort of approach here. I love how you start in this book, though, beyond your personal experiences of your baseball, going to games at the tender age of 13, which has a psychological effect, I think, perhaps. So there's no doubt about that. But I love you start with sort of almost an interesting juxtaposition, with a recounting of a little bit of a sense of the Mall of America, which stands today, and what preceded it, which is the old Metropolitan Stadium in Minneapolis. Did you intend on that to be sort of the case? Because you cannot think of a greater contrast yet thematic than to kind of root a lot of your thesis in that very location.
Well, I think a lot of this is just kind of the serendipity of field work, that you go out into different cities, you go to these different spaces. And I mean, yes, I had known that the old Met was out in Bloomington, and I knew that the Mall of America was out in Bloomington. And then, yes, I went to the Mall of America because, of course, you do that when you are in Minneapolis, in that area. I mean, it's the biggest tourist draw, I think, in the entire Midwest, is the Mall of America. And just walking around and seeing Harmon Killebrew's chair ensconced up in the wall, 500 whatever feet away, where he hit his longest home run. So in some ways, as I was kind of putting, framing the idea for the book, the concept for the book, the Mall of America, the prototypical, it's kind of the best example of the American shopping mall, literally being on top of what used to be a baseball stadium. And then the fact that the public transit line from Bloomington into Minneapolis begins at Mall of America and ends at Target Field. I mean, that was just a matter of serendipity right there. It was just too good to pass up.
So I'm an English major from undergrad. Can a metaphor be ironic? Because in this case, that almost seems like that's the best definition. Because a lot of your thematic here is rooted in the consumption bias, I guess, or activities of what today's sort of society is sort of rooted in and focused on. And it's hard to sort of it's hard to extract the two things, because here is baseball, sort of America's pastime, and with great lore and history and nostalgia, childhood memories, as you and I have kind of hinted at as well. You know, there's a psychological pull and attraction, at least historically, to that game, not necessarily other sports too, but certainly that one, and that of modern day society, which is very oriented towards consumption, shall we say. Maybe a few minutes about sort of how you sort of frame that logic of consumption sort of driving some of this narrative.
Well, one of my professors at Maryland is George Ritzer. He's written a number of books about the sociology of consumption. He came up with the theory of McDonaldization. He's really written a lot about how this idea that consumption is really the engine driving our economy. Marx focused a lot on production, and well, in our society today, it's consumption that drives our economic life, our economy.
Frankly, even now, the socialization of that, it's almost sort of becoming a rite of ritual where you sort of brag and show off, and social that drives your social communication, shall we say, and almost a status, if you will, in a sort of a bizarre and maybe perverse way.
Well, I mean, consumption has always had an element of show, especially amongst elite consumption. This idea of conspicuous consumption, that it isn't enough to be living the good life. It's about the world seeing that you're living the good life, and because you're able to live this great life, that confers status and significance and importance on a person. And I think a lot of our entertainment, a lot of reality TV is all about, let's see how the rich and the famous live. Let's see their sports cars and their mansions and their private jets. And let's look at all of that and be envious, because these are the people that really made it in America. But this form of conspicuous consumption is not just for the rich. Well, if you can't afford a Rolls Royce, well, there's a Mercedes. And if you can't buy a Mercedes, there's a Lexus. And if you can't buy a Lexus, there's there's a BMW or a Toyota or whatever. I mean, all of the things that we buy our cars not only get us from point A to point B, but they communicate something about ourselves. A pickup truck, it matters. That you're telling the world, this is who I am by the things that I buy, the things that I drive, the things that I wear. I'm going to signal to you my politics. I'm going to signal to you my wealth. I'm going to signal to you my values. I'm going to let you know by the way that I consume that you're going to read a lot about me, that just looking at me, you're going to know something about me. And of course, as we are all very sophisticated consumers of our culture, we look at other people, and again, we read what they've bought, what they're wearing, and we know a lot about them just from the image they project.
How does that eventually fuse? And I know we're kind of skimming across. There's a whole thesis, and it's 300 and some odd pages of goodness here in this book, and I highly recommend it to more of our more astute listeners. How does that fuse, that sort of general sort of thematic, into the I guess you could call it the evolution, and you do frame sort of a series of evolutions, if you will, of ballpark construction into what is now, as you're terming it, the mall parkization, if you will, the mall parks kind of dynamic. Because in some respects, my sort of, when you just describe that, my head kind of goes to sort of that sort of proverbial big boys and their toys. And historically, right, that's been men generally, usually, with money, usually either ill-gotten in some cases or begotten from fortunes derived from other things outside of sports, because sports itself was never really sort of the economic engine it is today. But, and buying, if you will, a trophy property in that of a team, a professional team, and or either influencing or creating and building, or some combination thereof, of the structure in which said team is also playing. There's a lot in there, but I would say, in the sort of history of, say, baseball and sports generally in the United States, I would even say not until fairly recently, that was pretty much the purview, the domain. It was a rarefied small group of people who had large checks who could afford that ultimate toy and bring it into a city or a region near them or you.
Yeah, I mean that we are talking about historically rich man's toys. Yes, let's say a lot of early baseball teams were owned by people like Spalding or Comiskey or the Griffith family, people or Connie Mack, people who had been in baseball and worked their way into management and eventually ownership of teams. But we also have to realize that a lot of early team owners, looked at team ownership as a way to do something that was politically popular, or leverage the stadium, put the stadium at the end of a trolley line that the team owner owned. Or, the story of Fenway Park, it's Fenway Park because the Taylor family that owned the Boston Red Sox in 1912 owned an awful lot of real estate in the Boston Fens. So they built a stadium amongst their real estate holdings, called it Fenway Park, wrote about it an awful lot in their newspaper, and sold some real estate. And then you have a lot of a lot of teams that become rich man's toys. But Phil Wrigley buys the Chicago Cubs, renames the stadium Wrigley Field, not necessarily because he was narcissistic and wanted to promote himself. He was selling his Wrigley gum. August Busch, when he bought the Cardinals in 1952, first thing he wanted to do was, he bought Sportsman's Park as well from the Browns, and the first thing he wanted to do was rename the stadium Budweiser Field. Major League Baseball, the commissioner's office, told him that he couldn't name the stadium after his beer. I guess it was too commercial for baseball in the 1950s. So August Busch did the next best thing. He named the stadium after himself. And then he went out and produced a beer, Busch beer, that he named after himself, that the stadium just happened to also promote. I guess kind of that Wrigley Field exemption gets carried across. And then, of course, you have a lot of people who are just sportsmen, people like Tom Yawkey, who bought the Red Sox as a personal toy, or somebody like Eugene Kaufman buying the Kansas City Royals and spending his own money to have a winning team during the 1980s. Back when you could lose a few $1,000,000 and win yourself a championship, because we're not talking about $300 million payrolls. We're probably talking about $10-15 million payrolls, which at the time, if you were extremely wealthy, was much more of a sportsman's toy than the big business it is now.
Well, take us through sort of this other thematic stream here, which is sort of, I guess, to encapsulate in layman's terms, sort of more of an understanding, I guess, of the evolution of how space was used or approached. It's obviously a bit more architectural, and maybe aligns a bit with our chat with Paul Goldberger back a bunch of years ago. The whole notion, though, of what the idea of a baseball park and or stadium, obviously it's part of the evolution, sort of evolved along with sort of this consumptive thing that you're hinting at too, right? And the big boys recognizing that over time, decades, that I guess the medium, so to speak, is the message here too. The place in which this excitement, this game, this commerce is occurring may not just be about decent sight lines and how many fans we can get to pay to watch the game. There's seemingly other things that can be aligned with, augmented by, added to the quote unquote experience of going to the old ball game.
Well, I think we're really talking about an evolution that really starts 160 years ago. That the question is, what can we get people to buy when they're at the stadium, when they're at the ballpark? Pay money to get through the gate. Well, you're inside the gate, and it takes probably close to 55 years, probably about 55 years from the time that Cam Meyer put a gate or a fence around the field until Charles Wiegeman basically decides, well, we have all these people coming from the outside walking up and down our stadium selling stuff. I'm going to put in concession stands. I'm going to sell food. And then as then everybody's looking at the Cubs and Wrigley Field and seeing them selling hot food and the team making the money. I mean, obviously farming a lot of it out to let's say concessionaires like Harry M. Stevens. That's one more thing we can sell. We can sell a few souvenirs. We can sell a few different types of foods. And then, as the 1960s and that generation of stadiums come around, people who were building those were saying, okay, what else can we do besides beer and soda and hot dogs and ice cream? And, with all these really modern and beautiful new super stadiums that we see during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they're diversifying the menu. They're offering more forms of souvenirs. But I think where the explosion happens is during the 1980s, and it's a convergence of a few different things. First off, there are the economics of sport were changing dramatically. That, for example, in 1977, when Major League Baseball expanded into Seattle and in Toronto, teams were sold for about $7.25 million each, $7.5 million each. So, but when the expansion takes place into Colorado and Miami in the 90s, now we're talking $95 million for an expansion franchise. So won't say it goes overnight from something that could be a rich man's toy to a really expensive corporate enterprise. But that's the transition taking place in the 80s. We also see HOK Sport really establishing itself and saying, we're going to build these stadiums all over the country. We know what we're doing. We have the specialty practice. We know how to calculate every dollar or every square foot and put a dollar value on it and how it's going to enhance the experience. And then you have Camden Yards, the Orioles under Larry Lucchino, Eli Jacobs, and the vision, their vision and the execution by Janet Marie Smith, where they say, these functional facilities, they may be great, they may enable a lot of different events to take place, but we want to create a ballpark. We want to create a space where going to a baseball game is about the game itself, where people can enjoy some nostalgia, think back to the way things were, but we want people to be comfortable. We want people to be able to do all the shopping. So by the 90s, we have kind of this first iteration of the Mallpark, which is, as I describe in the book, a really a merger of a shopping mall, a theme park, and a ballpark within that singular space.
Well, let's drill down a little bit on Camden Yards, because that is clearly ground zero, I think, for sort of the modern projection of what you're talking about here, and refined and or augmented or I don't know, Frankensteined since, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But there's a lot going on here with this, right? You mentioned sort of the confluence of the team, in this case, the Maryland Stadium Authority, which is sort of the government agency that was created to sort of bring this into being, and obviously the economics of that, the politics of that. HOK Sports, which you mentioned, is one of sort of the leading architects. There are a few others out there too, not just in baseball, but other sports as well. But it's a really interesting sort of dynamic, because it's you described it, right? It's really kind of a retro thing here, right? Where it's like we're going back, if you will, to tap into that nostalgia, sort of aesthetically get into the game of presentation and harken back, if you will, to sort of the the golden age, if you will, of how the game was played, and yet making it sort of comfortable with all the modern conveniences. I guess the question in there, or the sort of observation perhaps, is it feels a bit devious in its construct, right? I'm not sure that everybody who is participating in the creation of this sort of felt that way, but there's a psychology at play, right? This is a game of baseball. There is nostalgia there. It is multi or intergenerational. It's the pastime of the United States, so it has a long arc of history and connotes a lot of memories, personal and beyond. But when you sort of bring in all that consumptive stuff that you're talking about previously, and recognizing that the commerce is literally a memory blip away from your seat or walking to it, it feels a bit manipulative if you think about it. Am I reading too much into that, or is that sort of thematically correct?
Well, I mean, I obviously I think there's a good deal of manipulation to it. I think that when we trade in nostalgia in general, there's always going to be manipulation. It's a version of the past, and there are many versions of the past, many stories about the past that can be told. For instance, at Camden Yards, at Camden Station, and in 1877, there was a major labor riot that resulted in the massacre of a number of unionized workers on strike. And there's a small plaque outside of Camden Yards, just off the street, that mentions this event. But of course, inside Camden Yards, well, Babe Ruth's father had his pub in what is now center field. So the question is, which story are you telling about? Which story are you going to tell? And obviously that's a choice that Orioles management, Maryland Stadium Authority, and HOK came to, that yes, we're going to tell the story about baseball's past. And of course, I think more than any other sport, baseball trades on its history.
All right, what's this? 417 helmets. My goodness. Well, you've heard me talk about 417helmets.com, collectible helmets and more on this very show fairly often. Our pal Judd Lesher down in southwest Missouri, I think in the Springfield, Missouri area, if I'm not mistaken. What is it? 417helmets.com. Well, first, if you dig all of our great football stories and episodes of the past, and you'd like to commemorate some of them in mini helmet form, really cool, sort of literal, high quality, professionally, made materials, but in a mini format that you could put on your desk or put on your in your bookshelf or whatever it is, and just about every league that's ever existed, save from the NFL. We're talking XFL, old versions of the WFL. Remember the World Football League? How about various teams, both current and past, in the Canadian Football League, but also NCAA teams of yore and NAIA college football teams of yore, all of them and many, many, many more available for you at 417helmets.com. But that's not it. That's not it, friends. There's plenty more to be had. How about mini baseball helmets? Yeah, a whole bunch in the Negro Leagues, and yes, officially licensed by the Negro League Hall of Fame. You can get a bunch, and they're making more all the time. And by the way, custom helmets can be made too, both of the baseball and the football variety. You got your business, maybe a promotional thing you want to do for your company, perhaps your organization, you want to raise some funds, all that kind of stuff. Great custom approaches to both mini football and mini baseball helmets can be made at your command. For you to enjoy and to sell or resell or give away, all of that and more. That's the more part at 417helmets.com. It's collectible helmets and more. And we've got a promo code for you, too, for whatever you purchase. All of them, all of your purchases, 10% off all of those when you use the promo code GOODSEATS. Again, promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases at 417helmets.com. Thanks, Judd, and thank you all for listening and trying them out. And now back to our conversation. Well, you're mentioning Camden Yards, which is sort of an attempt to go retro with the future sort of neatly embedded. But you also describe, I think it's in your chapter 6, that a number, not too many, but certainly a number of ballparks are not immune historically to retrofitting their structures as well. You mentioned Fenway, clearly Wrigley Field, and now the sprawling environs or fast becoming sprawling environs nearby, Dodger Stadium, and a few others, right? So that's almost a little bit of a different and more, I guess, tricky trick in that one has to, do this sort of mallification within the boundaries, literally, of the old ballpark, so to speak, and not sort of creating something new or new old from whole cloth.
Right. I mean, the thing about Wrigley Field, Fenway Park, and Dodger Stadium, first we have to recognize that even before Camden Yards was built, the experience at Fenway Park in 1989 was vastly different than the experience of Fenway Park in 1960, vastly different than 1940, vastly different than in 1920. Dodger Stadium has evolved over time. These are living, breathing spaces that it's more than just a coat of paint that and open up the gates for the next season. That they were always making changes to these stadiums. I mean, I think part of the great nostalgia for a place like Ebbets Field is that it stopped changing when the Dodgers left, and it got consigned to memory and history when it got knocked down in the 60s. Because Fenway Park, it kept changing. Wrigley Field, they put lights up there in 1988. I mean, that in order to be viable, these stadiums have always had to make changes. And I think the challenge for the Cubs, the Dodgers, and the Red Sox was, at the start of the 21st century, was, okay, Camden Yards and its imitators have all the charm of early 20th century baseball, but I mean, I don't know if you've been out to the grandstands in Fenway Park.
Sure.
That's not a comfortable experience.
No, it's not.
I mean, you're at a narrow seat. Your knees are in the back of the person in front of you, and you're getting really close to other other Red Sox fans, because that's how people sat in the 1930s when Tom Yawkey renovated the ballpark to what we see now.
Well, yeah, sorry, and Wrigley it has its own quirks and stuff too. I mean, there are girders, right, that obstruct views, right? That's an anathema in today's sort of modern realm, right, of ballparks and whatnot. But that's still the historical charm. But it also outlines, shall we say, the limitations. I mean, my hint on the Wrigley thing was, and I know that more intimately because I live in Chicago. If you can't, whatever you can't do inside the stadium now has become seemingly a real estate play in and around the stadium, leading up to. Maybe it has nothing to do with the game at all, per se, but the attraction is now becoming more year-round and surrounding the game, where the game is just but a component of a larger, at least desired experience.
Well, that's what we're selling nowadays, are these experiences. Actually, Bill Veeck recognized that in the 1940s, was that he was selling an experience of baseball. He knew that the people coming through his gates were not going to be the hardcore, can tell you how the team did 8 years ago and compare today's right fielder to the guy who played right field 35 years ago. I mean, those are the core fans. Those are the hardcore. But most people coming to watch baseball are going to the game to be entertained. And sometimes that entertainment, hopefully that entertainment is the game. Much more watchable this year than previous, to tell you the truth. But it's going to be the game, and yeah, that's the core product. But when you're at the game, well, let's have food that's good. Let's have, let's learn something about the game. Let's make sure the kids who were there aren't going to be bored out of their mind. They can burn off some energy, and they can interact with the mascot, and they might, and people might learn something about the team's history in the museum. And there are just multiple ways to be entertained, and obviously multiple ways to be entertained mean multiple ways to get people to buy stuff. And I think, one of the challenges for Fenway Park, since that's that and Dodger Stadium were the two that I looked at in depth, is that, well, first, Fenway Park, they had to realize that, well, they had to determine if the stadium itself could remain viable, had the electrical capacity to run pizza ovens, or had the workout room for the players, so they could be professional for the 8 hours that they are physically on site, that they could do the workouts, and that they could go in the indoor batting cages, and just make sure that it's viable from a functional standpoint. And once it was viable from a functional standpoint, then they tried to figure out if it was viable from an economic standpoint, where they could do, where they could make money. And with Wrigley, it is a real estate play. It is putting more things on that block, using kind of all, every available space. That it isn't good enough anymore to have a building sitting on the site that, for all intents and purposes, is just there operating as a bunch of storerooms. Everything has to have a financial return to it. And I think that's what we see, certainly with the renovations they've done at Wrigley.
Do you think perhaps we're at the cusp of maybe another era, so to speak? Because I think the ultimate expression of this perhaps is what the Braves did down in Atlanta with Truist Park, and literally just moving right out of anything close to the center of Atlanta, going to a suburb north of, and I guess it could be best described as sort of, it's almost like a corporate real estate kind of environment, which just happens to have a baseball stadium in the middle of it. Now, I don't know how destination oriented that is. I mean, arguably what they're trying to do at Wrigley is to make it more of a thematic destination. I guess perhaps what the Angels have been trying to do, despite various shenanigans of local government and other distractions, trying to kind of radiate out a bit from the ballpark's geography there, to kind of encompass some other things that can go beyond the ballpark itself. I don't know. It feels to me like certain things are being lost in this process, where or when a ballpark is but a building in a multi-building complex, and to your point, your discretion, a real estate play.
Right. And I think that has been the direction that it's going. I think by the late, I guess early 2000s or late 2000s, Populous, as HOK Sport rebranded itself, had probably figured out how to maximize the financial return of every square foot of public facing space in a stadium, and how to most effectively use all of the backstage spaces, again, to maximize that economic return and the functionality of the stadium. And we look around the stadiums, and they have. I mean, I remember as I was going on my trip with my father that I think there were 5 or 6 different varieties of seats you could buy, going from about $4 up to the kind of the $12 or $15 box seats that were just really expensive. I mean, we were splurging when we spent that $15 on a box seat. Now the electronic ticketing systems that they have are not only so sophisticated that they now break down stadiums into 20 different areas that they can sell tickets for. I mean, not even talking about kind of the $100 or $200 luxury club seat, but we have $60 tickets, $55 tickets, $53 tickets.
It's almost dynamic. I think dynamic pricing and the data attached to that too.
Right, and it is dynamic, that they have figured out pretty much how much they can get for every single seat to absolutely maximize their revenue. And then they even have it figured out that that when the Yankees are coming to town, those seats are going to be more expensive than the Royals are coming to town. So gone from 6 different prices to see an Orioles game in the early 80s to 120 different prices depending on your seat, the day of the week, and the opponent. And then inside, with all the different consumption opportunities, they really figured out how to get every dollar out of people when they're at the games. So the question then became, what's next? And what's next is the real estate play. Now, somewhere like Wrigley Field, they had the real estate, they had the space, so you could build the complex that they built next to Wrigley Field because it was on Cubs property. What happened in Atlanta is just taking this 70-acre pristine piece of real estate and saying, and the Braves saying that we are going to develop this piece of land so every nickel that is spent by people who are not only coming to our games, but from the time they get out of their car till the time they get back in their car, the Braves are getting a taste of it. If somebody's going to the pizza place, the Braves are getting a piece of it. If people are going to Sport and Social at Battery Atlanta Live, the Braves are getting a piece of it. If somebody's staying at the Omni Hotel, the Braves are getting a piece of it. If somebody is working at Comcast or Xfinity or whatever it's called nowadays, the Braves are getting a piece of it. And it's just that next evolution, that it's not just what happens in the stadium, but it's about capturing as much of the economic activity that happens outside of the stadium, because they maximize what's going on inside. Now it's, how do you, with team prices going from the hundreds of millions into the billions, how do you ensure that the team price goes from $2 billion to $4 billion over the next 15 years? And it's the real estate play that does that.
Yeah, I'm not an economist. I just play one on television. But I guess the added wrinkle of that is the arrival of private equity into this mixture. And private equity does what private equity does. And, this is an asset class, if you will, that's been historically sports teams in these closed leagues largely, the traditional model has been you run the business or the enterprise as close to break even as possible, generally losing money in the day to day, perhaps eking out a profit if you're successful in that regard, and the money is generally made on the on the transfer of the license, if you will, the franchise, the sale of such, for an enterprise value that's in theory grown to a substantial amount. Hence, it being a rich man's historically game, big boys and their toys. But I think with the arrival of all these myriad revenue streams, a lot of which, not completely, but a lot of which have been facilitated by, I guess you could call it rethinking what a stadium, a ballpark is supposed to do besides just present the game. It seems like a lot of moneyed people are coming in from the outside, looking at these as, shall we call them, maybe more short-term value propositions and enterprises that can be perhaps in the next number of years flipped for higher valuations a little bit more quickly and with more liquidity than simply buying and holding, shall we say, over 10, 20 years, which has historically been kind of the wealth generator of franchises.
Well, I mean, I think, again, we're in a completely different world. I mean, that, 50 years ago when, a millionaire could spend $5 million to buy a baseball team, if he lost a couple 100,000 or was breaking even over a period and selling it, let's say during the 80s or 90s for $20 million or $50 million. There's a lot of appreciation there that they're capturing at the end. But now we're not talking about a $5 million investment. We're talking about a $5 billion investment. And when you're talking about those sums of money, when you're talking hundreds of millions and into the billions, there is a demand for an immediate return on investment. Maybe not necessarily, to provide a 8% return or a 6% return on capital to ownership. Maybe they're not not necessarily needing that, but if they have $2 billion in loans at 4%, well, that's $80 million in debt service. So they're going to need solid revenue streams that are going to produce, that are going to produce real profits to be able to cover the cost of money. It's one thing to have a $5 million investment that, for all intents and purposes, isn't producing revenue. On the other hand, when you're talking billions of dollars, money has to come in.
Yeah,
and that's what these villages do for stadiums.
Yeah, and it brings up some really existential sort of questions. So let me sort of cul-de-sac this or round third base on this conversation with maybe your opinions, because a lot of what you've laid out here is thematically extremely interesting and engrossing in many respects. But personally, I'm not so sure that I necessarily like where all this is going. Now, that's my opinion. That's an old man yelling at the clouds, or whatever that might be. But I'm curious as to, through all of this investigation and the publishing of this, and your academic underpinnings prior to this. How do you sort of personally feel about this? I mean, you mentioned going to games when you were 13, and obviously you outlined the book by rooting it in some personal experiences, watching the games and that kind of stuff. Where are we headed with all of this sort of capital C commercialization of the game to these arguably very extreme points now, some of which are still uncertain as to where they all sort of end up? What do you think is going to happen, and or how do you feel sort of about the game of baseball given all of this?
Well, I mean, I think the game obviously is going to continue to evolve. I think what Major League Baseball has done this year with the pitch clock, with the pace of the game, with the various shifts and rule changes that it's made, I think is making the core product, much better and much more interesting. I think that sabermetrics, just got to the point where they figured out they cracked the code of baseball. They figured out the most efficient way to play the game, and frankly, it became kind of boring and repetitive because everybody was doing the same things. At least now, not only is the pace up, but they're figuring out different ways to play the game. So I think on one hand, we have the game itself adapting to speak to the modern consumer, but at the same time, or the modern sports fan, at the same time, still not making such fundamental changes in the game that it's still recognizable. If you brought a baseball fan from the 1920s and you showed him today's game, I don't think it would be that foreign to his experience.
Except perhaps affordability.
And I think that's where the commercialization of the game, I think in some ways is very short-sighted, because the next generation has to be brought in. And it's one thing to make changes around the margins of the game to ensure that the pace is such that that kids can enjoy the game of baseball again. And I think that's very important. The challenge, of course, is affordability. I don't think a lot of teams are doing a very good job of it. Obviously, you go to a minor league game, it's a lot more affordable to go to the minors, and can also be a great experience as well. But I think when we're kind of looking at the architecture and the development of stadiums currently, I as part of this research, I went to a game at the Oakland Coliseum. And
oh boy, there you go. You were really glutton for punishment there, but talk about visceral.
Oh my God. But I had to admit, the Oakland Coliseum, which the book Dodger Dogs to Fenway Franks, a book about stadiums written in the
got
80s.
It on my shelf. It holds up, even though it doesn't, right?
Right. I mean, it ranked the Oakland Coliseum like in the top 5 of stadiums in the mid 80s. And my father lived for a few years out in the San Francisco Bay Area. We went to more than a few Oakland A's games, and I had found nothing wrong with the Coliseum. Now, when I went back there, probably about 7-8 years ago, it was such a terrible facility for baseball compared to everything else. Now, of course, it brought back a lot of nostalgia. It was so terrible, it was wonderful in some respects. But um, but it was also completely inadequate for what today's not just baseball fan or sports fan wants, but today's consumer of entertainment. And yeah, that's the dirty secret of baseball, is that it's always been an entertainment product. I mean, that's what Bill Veeck recognized in the 1940s, is that people are spending good money to be entertained. And perhaps you can't promise them that the baseball game that they're going to watch is going to be gripping or epic or close. The home team isn't always going to win. You aren't going to see somebody hit 3 home runs. The historic, the historic things are far and few between. But you give them some fireworks, you give them a mascot, you give them a museum, you give them a kids area, you give them an aquarium, you give them decent food. There's going to be something for everybody. So at the end of the night, they feel like they've had a good time. And that is what the Oakland Coliseum was completely incapable of providing to people. And that's what the stadiums back in the 80s really couldn't do, is that it gave you baseball, but it didn't give you an entertainment experience.
And that's the I guess that's the crossroads we find ourselves in. And I think it's applicable too to sports generally, right? I mean, the explosion of Major League Soccer and their soccer specific stadium approach, right? 20,000, 25,000, right? Not too big, but not too small. And owning those revenue streams and I guess perhaps trying to ensure some level of durability of those revenue streams, despite a team not doing well on the field per se, right? At least the attraction is still around and open for business, so to speak.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because you have to give people value for money. It's nice that the home team wins, but I want to make sure that the evening was enjoyable. That I've spent my money well to go to a baseball game or to a soccer game or to a hockey game or whatever. Because if I'm not going to a hockey game or a baseball game, I could be going to a concert. I could be going to the movies. I could be going to a restaurant. I could be putting that money aside so I can travel during the summer. I'm going to spend that money on something that I'm going to have a good time with. And that's what, and that's the challenge that all professional sports have, is making sure that they are providing an entertainment experience that people will say, yeah, I want to do that again.
All right, our thanks to Michael. And the book is a very interesting, intriguing, and enjoyable read. It made me think a lot about where things stand in the realm of commercialism in sports and baseball in particular. And again, it is called Mallparks, Baseball Stadiums and the Culture of Consumption. It is available now wherever you find good books. It is published by the University of Cornell, or Cornell University, however they're calling themselves. Press, Cornell University Press. That's what I'm trying to say. And wherever you get good books, and of course the most convenient way and the most supportive way you can do so, getting said book or Kindle version is to purchase it through our link on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 310 with Michael Friedman, and you will find a convenient link to this book or Kindle version, and we will get a couple of shekels of referral love, and we could not appreciate that more. It's the least you can do. It's the only thing we ask you for to keep our lights on and pay our bills, and we appreciate that to no end. And again, while you're there at goodseatsstillavailable.com, you can search up every stinking episode we've ever done. We post them all there. If you're not subscribed or following us in your feeds, well, you should be doing that too. But a convenient way to kind of just drive around and sort of test drive, if you will, I guess, a couple of episodes. That's the best place to do it. It's also the most convenient place to see all the other books and movies we've highlighted and stuff and that kind of stuff. What else? You can send us email. By all means, please do that. We're at hello at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Hello at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Yeah. We are on the socials. Twitter, you'll find us at goodseatsstill. On Instagram, you'll find us at goodseatsstillavailable. On Facebook, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available, and on YouTube. We're on the YouTube as well at Good Seats Still Available as well. Our thanks, of course, to Jerry Payne Audio Excellence. He a constant inhabitant of Truist Park and the Atlanta Braves season there. I'm sure he's had a few of the novel new food items, and I'm sure he'll be able to taunt me with various exploits of the fine food that is available there for the rest of the season. Thank you all for listening. More fun and excitement coming your way next week. Stay tuned. Until then, check your feeds and stay safe, everybody. Happy summer.